we are going to look at the therapeutic index. That is actually a measurement of how effective a drug is compared to its toxicity. And it's actually calculated differently between animals and humans. But before we go into that, we need to look at some terms. So here we have some terms. ED50, it's called the effective dose. And that is actually when 50% of the animal population have an effect of the drug. Then we have the toxic dose. And the toxic dose is actually when 50% of the human population causes a toxic effect of that dose of a drug. Then we have the lethal dose. And that is the amount of drug required to kill 50% of the animal population. So as you maybe noticed, the 50, that's short for 50% of the population. E is for effective, T for toxic, L for lethal, and all of the D's are for dose. So we're talking about the dose of a drug. So if we now go into what is the therapeutic index. So for animals, it's the lethal dose divided by the effective dose. So this means that when you have a 50% of the population is killed because of the dose of the drug, and you divide that by when 50% of the animal population have a noticeable effect. That is the therapeutic index for animals. For humans, it's more or less the same, just that for humans we use the toxic dose instead. And that is because it is some ethical issues about using animals for drug research for human drugs. And we can't have a look at when it kills 50% of the human population. That will also not be ethical. So instead we use toxic dose. So they are more or less the same, just that for animals we use lethal dose, and for humans we use toxic dose. So we can have a look at one graph. So if we have a look here we have percentage of individual responding to this dose. And here we increase the dose of the drug. So if we imagine we're taking painkillers. If we start here, we take a super small amount of painkillers. Nothing happens, no effect. We increase the dose a bit and we see that, okay, a small amount of the population have an effect of this amount of the painkiller. We increase it a bit more. So now we have 50% of the population do actually have less pains, because that's the effect of painkillers. But what happens if we increase the dose even more? We increase it even more, and that will cause a toxic effect. The body will start to respond in a way that we don't want. And if we increase it even more, we take even more painkillers, okay, then it can be deadly. Maybe it kills some of the people in the population. So actually, the smaller the value of the therapeutic index, the more dangerous the drug and the greater need for careful control in how and when we take the drug. Meaning that if these two values, now we're talking for humans it's between toxic dose and effective dose. So if these two are quite close together, that means that we need to be more careful when we take the drug. That makes sense, right? Because if the TD, the toxic dose, was even closer here, so when you have a effect of the drug, you take just a little bit more and it's toxic, then we need to be more careful when taking the drug. So what we want is this one to have a long distance in between. And we actually call the distance between these two the therapeutic index as well. So this, we can say it's the therapeutic index, and we just go down to the x-axis. Just go down to the x-axis. And we can say that the therapeutic index will be in between these two. And we have one more term that's called the therapeutic window. So the therapeutic window is actually the minimum amount of drugs that should be used to achieve the desired effect. So we want just to use this effect. This drug, I mean. So if we use this drug, everyone in the population have had an effect. It doesn't make sense for us to use even more, because then we're closer to the toxic dose. So the therapeutic window is when most of the population have an effect. Most of the population have an effect. And before we come to the toxic effect, so that will be in between here. Meaning that if we go straight line up here and straight here, we see that actually all of every dose that have an effect, but it's not still toxic, that will be the therapeutic window. So we want to use a dose within the therapeutic window.